In 1199, John rose to the throne of England. But the kingdom he inherited, though powerful, was already beginning to crack from within. The nobles did not trust him. The people were exhausted by heavy taxes. And King Philip II of France was waiting to turn John's weakness into opportunity. In 1203, France laid siege to one of England's greatest fortresses, Chateau. King Philip II advanced steadily, capturing Normandy piece by piece. John failed to rally his armies. England's continental lands were slipping away. In 1204, Normandy was lost. The defeat shattered King John's authority and prestige. After losing Normandy, John faced a new crisis. This time, his enemy was not France, but the Church. A bitter dispute erupted between King John and the Pope over who would become Archbishop of Canterbury. Pope Innocent III refused to back down, and John rejected the Pope's decision. In 1208, the Pope placed England under interdict. Churches closed, religious services stopped, and fear spread across the kingdom. As the crisis deepened, the spiritual leader prepared to make his final move. In 1209, King John was excommunicated. He had lost not only political support, but also religious legitimacy. The king's authority collapsed. England's barons quietly began to unite against him. John now faced three enemies at once: the Pope, France, and his own barons. After years of isolation, John realized he could no longer resist. In 1213, he accepted the Pope's authority and sought to end his excommunication. John signed an agreement placing England under the Pope's protection. But the king's surrender did not calm the barons. Instead, rebellion became inevitable. John had made peace with the Pope, but he could no longer control his own barons. Barons from across England united. Their goal was not simply rebellion. This time, they intended to force the king to obey the law himself. England was moving toward one of the most important confrontations in its history. The rebellion could no longer be stopped. The barons gathered their armies and marched against the king. John could still fight, but no one was certain he could win. At last, both sides agreed to meet on the fields of Runnymede beside the River Thames. No one knew this meeting would change not only the fate of a king, but the future of freedom itself. June 15, 1215. On the fields of Runnymede, one of history's most important meetings began. The barons were not simply rebelling. They wanted to limit the king's power with written law for the very first time. Under immense pressure, John had no choice but to accept the terms. The Magna Carta signed that day would become not only a symbol of England, but of the rule of law itself. Everyone believed the agreement had brought peace, but John had a very different plan. Within days, he began searching for a way to destroy the Magna Carta. John turned to his most powerful ally, the Pope. And before long, England stood on the edge of war once again. John had accepted the Magna Carta, but at the same time, he was asking Rome for help. John argued that the agreement had not been accepted freely, but under the threat of force. Soon, the decision was announced. The Magna Carta was declared invalid. For the barons, there was no turning back. England was once again descending into civil war. The rebel barons made an astonishing decision. They offered the English crown to Prince Louis of France. Louis accepted the offer. In 1216, he landed on the shores of England with his army. London opened its gates. Many nobles now believed Louis was the rightful king. England had been divided, and John was closer than ever to losing his crown. As the French advanced, John retreated north, but now he was racing not only against his enemies, but against time itself. In the autumn of 1216, the king fell gravely ill. Within days, his condition rapidly worsened. On October 19, 1216, King John died. His death would completely change the course of the war. The crown now passed to his 9-year-old son, Henry, and a new chapter in England's history was about to begin. Only 9 years old, Henry was crowned king. England's future now rested on the shoulders of a child. But the kingdom would not be led by Henry. It would be guided by England's greatest knight, William Marshal. His first decision surprised everyone. The Magna Carta was restored. In an instant, everything changed. England was no longer fighting for a king, but for its future. In 1217, the two armies met at Lincoln. This battle was no longer just for a throne. It was for England's future. William Marshal gave the order to charge. Within minutes, the battle began to turn. The French army was retreating. For the first time, the rebellion was collapsing. But the victory was not yet complete. One final battle would decide the fate of England. France had not given up. A powerful fleet carrying soldiers and supplies was sailing toward England. Off the coast of Sandwich, the two fleets collided. This battle would become England's final test. The English won a decisive victory. France's hopes of conquering England disappeared beneath the waves. The war was finally over, but its greatest legacy was not victory, it was the idea of liberty born from the Magna Carta. After months of war, both sides realized that peace had become inevitable. Prince Louis abandoned his claim to the English throne. At last, the long crisis began to come to an end. Young King Henry was no longer just a ruler. He had become the symbol of a united England. But the greatest legacy would not be who won the war, but the rules the war had changed. The new government made an unexpected decision. The Magna Carta was restored. This time, the goal was not only peace, it was to restore trust in the kingdom. As the years passed, the Magna Carta became more than a document. It became one of the foundations of English law. No one realized it that day. The step taken in 1215 would change not only a kingdom, but the very idea of freedom for generations to come. England was rising once again. This time, it wasn't only castles being rebuilt. Trust in the kingdom was returning as well. Kings remained powerful, but no ruler could ignore that absolute power had its limits. As the years passed, this idea grew stronger. The rule of law became one of England's greatest legacies. But England's story was far from over. New dynasties, great wars, and legendary rulers were about to change the course of history. Under Henry III, England slowly regained its strength. Cities expanded, trade flourished, and the kingdom prepared for a new era. Kings understood that swords alone could no longer secure a kingdom. Power, loyalty, and law now had to stand together. In the century ahead, England would stand at the center of events that would shape not only Europe, but the world. A new age was about to begin. An age of Edward I, William Wallace, the wars of Scotland, and some of the greatest struggles in history. Once on the brink of civil war, England was now marching toward a very different future. The legacy of the Magna Carta did not remain in England alone. For centuries, it inspired ideas of law and liberty across the world. But England's greatest struggles were still to come. New kings, new wars, and heroes who would shape history were waiting ahead. England's story is far from over. In the next chapter, we'll witness the rise of Edward I, the resistance of William Wallace, and England's transformation into one of Europe's greatest kingdoms. Subscribe and join us as we continue our chronological journey through world history.